Hi, everyone. Welcome to AllFree, a podcast for collective liberation.
Feeling the momentum of other people realizing that our liberation is interconnected, that our joy is interconnected, that this is not about being saviors or even allies. This is like what we are all working towards for our mutual liberation.
It's really false notion that the state can provide safety at the helm of other people's lives, as if safety could ever come from harming other people.
For us to be free, everyone must be free.
I'm playing different role, and Hannah's playing different role. Dima is playing different role. That it's all contributing into the better world that we wish to see for our children and the future generations.
Hello and welcome. I'm your co-host, Hannah.
And I'm your other co-host, Dima.
Today's episode includes an interview I did with Andre Henry last year that I, due to being really busy and eventually burning out, never published. But I think it's a really important conversation to share, especially with these recent crackdowns we're seeing on free speech in the US. Here's a bit about Andre. He is an activist and a musician I've been following for quite some time. He has authored a best-selling book that I read recently and highly recommend called All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, about his activism, about how the killing of Philando Castile altered his perspective, his life, and his approach to both faith and community. His work has led him to be a really trusted global voice on nonviolent struggle for social progress. What drew me to him in the first place is really the way that he chooses to approach nonviolence, which is very tactical and probably different from what most of you are used to hearing about nonviolence. He has extensively studied movements around the world, and he has built relationships with experts on effective strategies for activism. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the interview when Dima and I share some of our key takeaways. All right, so here it is.
So I want to start on a bit of a light note. Let's talk about the apocalypse. You talk about embracing the apocalypse in your book, and I love the way you talk about it. And I think that it's pertinent right now. So do you mind sharing a little bit about what you mean when you say embrace the apocalypse, and how your experiences might help other activists and just people who are going through their own kind of apocalypse at the moment?
Of course. So in my book, I talk about the how I was introduced to the concept of the apocalypse, which is through like evangelical Christianity, American evangelical Christianity. And really growing up, apocalypse meant like doomsday prophecies, right? But I went to Bible college, I went to seminary, and I learned through studying, like my second theology degree is in biblical languages. So I learned that like we get the word apocalypse from this Greek word meaning to unveil or to reveal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even a lot of the doomsday stuff that I was hearing growing up as a kid was based on, this really highly symbolic, book in the Bible that was really kind of like just a critique of the Roman Empire, right? And so like what John is trying to do in the book of Revelation, which in Greek is apocalypse, is trying to unveil or reveal the true nature of the Roman Empire to his compatriots, because there was all of this pressure to conform, assimilate, worship Caesar, all this kind of stuff. So I use that like as a framework for my own political awakening in the book. And because all empires do that, like empires are built on violence, they're built on domination, but they create this ideology, this revised history, so that people can live within that violence, and participate in that violence, to applaud that violence, and be okay with it, right? Or to not even see it, right? And so, the ancient world had the ancient empires, the empires of the ancient world is what I'm trying to say, all have their version of that. Like I talk about Pax Romana in the book, and America has its version of that, about manifest destiny, for instance, that God has given them Rhode Island. And so therefore they have the right to, to genocide the natives there, or, you could go on and on and on. Even up to today, like the other day, Kamala Harris said, America is not a racist country and has never been a racist country. And I'm like, where have you been? You know, where is this America?
God.
So I went through this journey in the book because I grew up in that education in America. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The leader of the free world, this beacon of democracy. And I will say, now that I've met more people from around the world, more activists from around the world, there is some truth to America, having a level of democracy that other places don't have. But it is definitely not the place that it is advertised to us.
Yeah.
So anyway, I talk about that growing up and being indoctrinated into America's imperial ideology and waking up from it, and how painful that was and how transformative that was. And to your point, I think that that is happening all over the world right now, right? At the time of this interview, people are waking up to the global system of capitalism, the violence and misery the violence that fuels it, the misery it produces, and the connections between all our different struggles.
I think an awakening can be really painful because there's this illusion that we've been buying in, and then when you have to let go of that illusion, I remember my awakening, which was because of Black Lives Matter in 2014 and 2015. And it felt like, I grew up in Florida and I just didn't know the history of the town that I was in. I felt like I didn't know anything. I felt like I had been lied to. And I was living in New York at the time, and I heard a lot of stories, like people's personal stories of police brutality, and that were recent. And I really felt like, as I started to look into things more because of that and understood mass incarceration, it just felt like I'd been buying into this lie, and now I needed to, figure out where to go from there. So what do you feel like for those who are waking up to this around the world, and realizing that they've been sold a lie? What do you recommend? Like, where do we go from there? What should you do once you've woken up?
Ooh, what a big question. Like, first off, I totally relate to you when you say that. And I think that you put language to some of the feelings that I felt in my own. Like, I know it's painful, but as you were talking, the question flitted through my mind, like, why is it so painful? And there is this sense of betrayal that comes with that, but there's also so much loss, when you grow up singing songs like "I'm proud to be an American," right, and things like that, that's a hint at like what we lose in waking up to the whole story, right?
Yep.
So I think the few things I name in the book would be things that I would say, like, look out for, or maybe there is some intention that you can have in it. Because one thing I realize is that as you wake up, you're gonna lose friends. Like, that's what my book is about, right? Like, all the white friends I couldn't keep. I don't want to go too deep into this because I want for us to have time to keep talking. So, but just someone once told me that when you're waking up to this kind of truth, you have to go through like the stages of grief. And after you get through the denial, there's anger, right?
Yep.
And so, like, even if you could get through to the people who are thoroughly indoctrinated into this stuff, even if you get through the denial phase with them, the next stage for them is anger. And so be prepared to lose people, right? But also be prepared to gain another community, right? Because there will be people who share your values, who see what you see, maybe even see more than what you see, right? And so what do you say? Like, take heart, right? To know that, like, it is a painful process. You will get through it, and you will have another community on the other side, right? I remember reading a chapter from this book that I love called "The Impossible Will Take a Little While." Have you heard of it?
No, but that's a great book title.
It's a wonderful collection of essays
Okay.
from what I like to call tomorrow makers, you know, writing about, it's basically a book about hope. And while I'm mentioning that, I'll say the other thing I would recommend is to try to cultivate hope. I know that people have different relationships with that word hope, you know, but I found it very helpful for me to be intentional about cultivating hope in my journey, because things can be so bleak, like that apocalyptic awakening. At one point, I compared it to like the Matrix, where like the real world is like the sky is scorched and it's dark, and they're eating like slop on the Nebuchadnezzar, and that's a terrible way to live, you know.
Yeah.
So I was very intentional about cultivating hope. I would encourage people to do that. But in it, there's an essay from Howard Zinn that said, and he said, surround yourself with people who share your values, you know. And I have found that so important, is when you begin losing people, to not succumb to isolation, you know, or this kind of like self-righteous position, like I'm the only one I'm the only awake person, you know, or that kind of thing. But surround yourself with people who share your values. So I think I've already named community, cultivating hope. The other thing that I would say is also like center your well-being. That took me years. That took me years to learn, because you have this righteous anger, this justified anger as you go through this, and it's activating. It can fuel you, but it also can weather your body, you know. And I found myself eventually like, it can cause health problems. So center your well-being, take good care of yourself, and never stop learning, continue to read, because it's also very tempting to feel like you learn enough, and now your job is to just like kind of look down on people who don't know what you know. So like, stay humble and keep learning, because the rabbit hole knows no end, and don't just learn about like how fucked up the world is. There's also so much to learn about our own power, which is something I talk about in the book, is my journey of like having this awakening and learning like about how have people fought this before? How have people won victories against this before? And then the last thing that I would say is like, at least like identity is tied up in this. Like I think it was Frantz Fanon who said like you're not able to participate in revolution and it not change you. And I think that there is a loss of there's like a loss of your bearings, right? Identity wise, when you begin to wake up, because it's like, Fanon also talks about in his book, A Dying Colonialism, how colonialism wants to gut the colonized of their identity. It wants to hollow you out, right? And I think that even like under these kinds of systems of domination and oppression, they want to create an identity for you that serves the interests of the system, right? So when you begin to wake up, you kind of have to decide eventually, like, who are you? If you don't just fit into the boxes that domination culture wants you to fit into, who are you? And for me, and I write about this, later in the book, is about reconnecting to my Jamaican heritage and to my ancestors in Jamaica and stuff like that. And so just be prepared, like, for that transformational process, and for you to like kind of, I'm talking to your listeners, when I say you, to find new bearings, for who you are, because your values are shifting, your values are changing, your community is changing, and you're waking up to a broader story. So I think those are things that I would say, like, those are places to go. And as I'm saying it, I realize I think every chapter in my book is me trying to actually give people some of that, right? Every chapter ends with like, you know, like don't waste your time arguing with these people who don't want to move. Know that your anger is legitimate, and so on and so forth.
I want to go back to hope because after I went to Congo, which was nearly 10 years ago, I kind of woke up to certain ways that the world was working and international domination, especially from Western powers, and the history of colonization, which in DRC was one of the most horrific places.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I came back with, I did come back with a lot of secondary trauma, and I was really struggling. And I didn't feel like anyone understood. And I felt like I was sort of yelling at people to listen to what was going on. And I have felt periodically since then. I went to a therapist and was able to relinquish some of the responsibility, because I think that for me, sometimes I'm like, nobody's taking responsibility, so I'll take all the responsibility.
Right.
Savior mentality there. And so, but since then it was like, I've often been frustrated for how asleep people are to what's happening in the world. And so even though we're in this place of watching a genocide be broadcast for months, and it's horrific, and simultaneously watching people wake up and stand up does give me a ton of hope, because we need a certain amount of people to actually change things. And so for me, in the past 7 months, hope, I deal with grief. I have to let grief kind of pass through me. There's a lot of that, but hope has always been there. And then maybe 2 weeks ago, I just realized that like, I just don't have a lot of joy that I'm experiencing in my life. Like everything felt like obligation, even with like, I go for a walk because I know I need it. I eat because I know I should. I do this to hang out with friends because I know it's probably good for me. But there was no there was no desire. And there was just like the depth of joy was almost gone. And then because of that, hope was affected. And so I intellectually felt hopeful, but emotionally, I was not feeling it anymore. And so you talk about in your book having a hope regimen. And I'm learning what mine is now. Like I'm learning to find the joy to connect to the emotional side of hope, I guess. But what does your hope regimen look like? And I know it can look different for everybody, but what's a good place to start with that?
Yeah, so I do talk about this hope regimen where, like I mentioned, like I realized I had to be intentional about hope, because there's a recent study. I don't know how recent it is. When I say recent, it may be in the past 2 or 3 years, that showed that most Black activists are burning out around 2 years into their work. The other thing, though, is that like it takes about 2 years for you to get good at doing it, right? So just as people are building the skills to do their tomorrow making work, they're already burned out. And I found myself making a decision in 2016. Before then, I had started speaking up, but in 2016, I was like, no, I need to invest my body into raising awareness or pushing for change, and so I shifted my music. I was already doing music, and I was like, well, I'm going to write songs about this now. I'm going to perform them in my shows or whatever. And I found myself like a year later leading an activist group and writing and singing about all this kind of stuff. And I was already burned out, and I was so depressed because it didn't seem like we were making a difference, not even just me or my little group, just the whole Black Lives Matter movement. It just felt like we're not moving the needle here, because the police continue to kill Black civilians. Donald Trump was elected president, on a white nationalist platform, And so that's when I decided I need to get in touch about hope. So I have a couple of things that I do. And the thing I want to say is that it's seasonal for me, right? Is that it looks different as things evolve. So that started with me saying, that actually started with someone sending me a book about hope, Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit.
I've read it. It's good.
Yes, such a good book, right? And when she talks about how hope is not certainty, right? It's kind of like this humility about the future, and understanding that because the future is unwritten and I don't know what's going to happen, that leaves a crack in the door for us to act and possibly write, or affect the next chapter of history, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was so interesting. And so I made a resolution that I would always be reading a book about hope in what I was doing. And that's how I found The Impossible Would Take a Little While, and others, like, so it just became a part of something I did in the morning, is that I wanted to read something about hope from people who had been trying to change the world specifically, because otherwise everything that I found about hope was like, everything's going to be all right. And I'm like, why would you say that?
Some of it is like the spiritual bypass stuff as well.
Yes, exactly. Like, you have to have a reason. Like, for me, like, there has to be grounds for you to say that, things are going to be all right, or that you have hope or whatever. So I started looking for like these thick, robust, reflections on hope from people who had been through something, right? Or
they
people
have the
who had
authority.
really been trying to change the world. Yeah. And so that was one thing that I did. Like, I was always reading. The other thing that I realized is that, like, at the time, it was like more, I guess, I don't want to say utilitarian because I'm not sure I'm using that word correctly, but it felt as though my commitment to hope was so connected to the struggle that it was almost like I thought of it as, well, if I'm in bad shape, how am I going to keep doing this work?
Yep.
And over the years, that kind of shifted to, really. So we have to talk about the decline of the Black Lives Matter movement, because there was a moment in 2020 where it felt like, oh my gosh, is this gonna happen? Like, are we gonna abolish the police? Are we gonna defund the police? Like, are we gonna be in the streets until it happens? And I saw from within so much good movement work implode in the summer of 2020 because of internal problems, in activist circles and spaces. And that was crushing for me, because the thing that I was holding on to for years was that I don't know what's going to happen, but I know what can happen if we, learn about nonviolent resistance and we apply that wisdom. And I saw so many people who just weren't interested in learning about that kind of stuff, In fact, I saw a lot of the things that we protested against in the movement, and there was this
about that.
Yeah. For instance, like, I was a part of one group where the lead organizer was acting abusive to the rest of the chapter. And I kind of got roped in as like as another leader in the group, which it wasn't what I was looking for. Like, I literally showed up to a protest for Black Lives Matter with a speaker and a microphone that I would use for busking usually, but movements appropriate whatever systems and resources are there, right? And so my busking tools, my microphone and my speaker, were one of those things the movement appropriated that day. So I show up with my speaker and microphone and with these wipes, antibacterial wipes, so that people can be heard as they deliver their whatevers and chants or whatever to these crowds of people. And I'll just clean the microphone so that nobody catches COVID. That was I decided that'd be my part. But I ended up speaking because people know that, like, I study this stuff and I've been involved, and I got roped into co-leading this Black Lives Matter chapter. So anyway, I give that context because people started coming to me about how they felt like they were being treated by the lead organizer. And, it was triggering for some people because they've been in abusive relationships before and they felt like the same thing was happening. And so one day we had been protesting for like days, like action after action, and I could see people were tired. They wanted to, like, they have jobs, they have lives, they have families, and they've given up all of this to be on the street with us for days. But there was no debriefing, there was no like wellness centering, there was not, so they were just, they were getting burned out. So we're sitting out in the afternoon. It's the summer in Pasadena, which is very hot. And instead of like holding space for people to name their exhaustion and figure out some kind of solution, the lead organizer just starts going into this like pep talk about how Harriet Tubman got tired, but she didn't quit, and Jackie Robinson got tired and he didn't quit, and all this. And at this point, I'm like, this is bullshit. So I just got up and left. I'm like, I'm going to my car because I actually have work to do, So she follows me to the car and she's like, what's wrong with you? And I said, you're not listening to your people. She looks over at the people and looks back at me and goes, I'm not going to listen to them. This is a dictatorship. And there was this notion underlying that because there were so many non-Black people involved now that like, I'm going to scapegoat these people for all of the anti-Black hostility that Black people have endured from their communities, right? And so there were these layers of just, I was very surprised that she said that, but also like the idea that you could be an authoritarian in a liberation movement in that way, that you could scapegoat people and mistreat them and justify it by weaponizing your identity against theirs. Because I study social change and revolutions, it reminds me of many times where you have seen like transfers of authority or even movements where the people who are speaking about liberation and leading these groups, these movements, do actually topple the current regime and then become the new oppressive regime, right?
Yep.
So there was a huge loss of faith for me. I could go on and on and on about what I saw in 2020, but there was like a huge loss of faith for me, at the end of 2020. In fact, because of like the way that I was trying to bring some of the wisdom from past movements into what we were doing, and I finally quit that chapter. And when I quit that chapter, a bunch of people quit the chapter after me. I wasn't the first though. I want to say I did not break the seal, but a couple other people quit, and then I was like, oh yeah, I'll quit too. And then a bunch of people quit after me. I was blamed for the chapter imploding, and then next thing you know, I'm getting like threats to my safety from this other organizer and stuff, and people calling me, telling me, don't go back to Pasadena. They have gang ties. They're making threats on your life, da 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 da. And so like I ended up leaving and going to Jamaica heartbroken over the fact that like, over the toxicity that I saw. So I think we got into this because you were asking me about hope. And I think that this is relevant for me when I talk about hope because it made me have to go deeper than even trying to think about hope, right? Because when I started my hope regimen, the thing that I was wrestling with is, can Black people be hopeful under these conditions, right? But after that kind of disorienting experience in movement spaces, I ended up like having nightmares about what happened and, waking up with night sweats and all this kind of stuff. And I talked to my therapist and actually was diagnosed with PTSD. And so then the conversation became more about well-being. And I think that what I was I think what I was dipping my toe in when I wrote about that chapter on hope was actually the beginning of me starting to understand how important centering well-being is, you know, in our efforts for social change. And there's one more thing one more story I just want to add to this conversation is that what really made this connection for me was visiting Robben Island Prison in South Africa. Because Robben Island, you know, for those who don't know, is where Nelson Mandela was incarcerated, but also many just Black freedom fighters who were fighting against apartheid. And when you go to Robben Island, or if you just go to their website, you don't have to go to the actual island, you will encounter testimonies from former political prisoners and their words about not just their experience there, but about how they survived, how they chose to thrive. It really sat with me. It really struck me. There's one quote that I can't forget, and I can't remember his name, but he said that, well, first off, they all talked about what Robben Island was supposed to do in the terms of failure. They said they sent us to Robben Island to break our spirits, and they failed.
Wow.
And one of them said, they failed because the human spirit is like water, and it always finds a way around oppression. And so that has really been fueling a journey for me to learn more about well-being and to center it.
Wow.
A part of that is me reading about well-being, but really emphasizing practice. So now, like, one thing that I do, and I'll just leave it here, is whenever I experience something good, no matter how little it is, I focus and take a deep breath and count to 5 and try to store it in my body so that I can bring it back when I need to and just create this environment inside my body that feels good. One of those feelings is my friend Kaveh kisses me on the cheek when he sees me. And I remember being at an Action for Palestine in the rain, waiting for the police to come and get me, and breathing in deep and remembering what it feels like for Kaveh to kiss me on the cheek. And not feeling nervous about going to jail, you know? And I can't say that it always works that way, you know, and that it'll always be that powerful. But that's just an example, because I know you asked me for an example. So that's kind of what that hope regimen has evolved into, more of a, like, being intentional about my well-being and trying to use practical tools to cultivate that.
Wow, that's beautiful. So I know you have obviously a lot of experience with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that has brought a lot of expertise, but you've also studied a lot, movements and activists. And you talk about nonviolence in a way that really, like, disrupts, I think, the common perception of nonviolent activism, which is that it's passive, or that it's just one way, or it's just people going out on the streets. You talk about it in a very practical way. You call it militant nonviolence. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why militant nonviolence is important?
Yeah, militant nonviolence, or revolutionary nonviolence, some people call it, is important because sometimes I laugh at how the things go through my head. Because white people think they invented nonviolence, or they at least think they're the arbiters of it, right? Like, they think they're the referees. And so something has happened to nonviolence now that white people dominate the conversation that is akin to what happened to Christianity, rock and roll, you know, and other things, right? Is that nonviolent resistance was developed, pioneered, perfected through colonized people standing up to imperialism. And it is really, and in that tradition, you see that the focus has been about how do we, with our limited resources, how do we confront the powers that be? How do we get their boot off our neck? Right? Now, some have done that through the moral philosophies of their different religions, like Gandhi's nonviolence is definitely influenced by Jainism and Hinduism, I believe. And King's nonviolence is definitely influenced by his Christianity, you know. But there are different types, right? And so you have this very popular idea about nonviolence, but not nonviolent action, right? Not nonviolent struggle, not civil resistance.
Yep.
This vague notion of nonviolence, which is a miseducation about nonviolence that pervades, I think, the world. When you say the word nonviolence, people, if you really interrogate what people mean by nonviolence, they're not talking about taking action. You know?
Yep. Passivity.
And yeah, it's nothing. It's like you're really talking about inaction. Now, here's the funny thing is that when you read the history of nonviolence, these are ideas that even Gandhi and King were trying to fight with when they talked about nonviolence. Is that when we talk about nonviolence, we're not talking about inaction. And so the reason why it's so important is because for me, I am not a what they call principled nonviolence person. You know, I don't subscribe to nonviolence because I believe that it is morally superior to armed struggle. I am a proponent of nonviolence because the data favors it. You know that I'm referring to, obviously, Erica Chenoweth's work, you know, showing that between 1900 and I believe 2006, although I believe that they updated that data set, that nonviolent struggles were twice as successful as armed struggles. There are lower barriers to entry. You know, anyone can participate in nonviolent struggle. You know, these things are the reasons why I am a proponent of nonviolence. I bring in the militant part because, and I do have questions. Like I'm interrogating the militant part because of, you know, like that principle that Audre Lorde talks about, the master's tools in the master's house, right? Not dismantling the master's house. But King was militant about his nonviolence. You know, like he talked about, even in the I Have a Dream speech, he talked about a marvelous new militancy that was sweeping the country. And he often said things like nonviolence needed to be militantly developed. But if you trace like my philosophical genealogy, right, you will find folks like Gene Sharp, Bob Helvey, Serge Popovich, and these are people who intentionally appropriated military strategy into their understanding of nonviolence and took what they could use. I think that this type of nonviolent or this conception of nonviolence is important because it centers at taking action. Like it, I want to figure out like how the best way to say it. And I've said this so many times, I can't believe I'm trying to think of a new way to do it right now. But
and to play with new words and.
But this tradition of nonviolent action is about a real confrontation with oppressive power and taking away the political resources that oppressive power needs in order to continue oppressing.
Yep.
Right? And usually when you hear nonviolence in popular discourse, they're just talking about whether or not anyone broke any windows, whether they used any strong language, you know, something that might be offensive to their sensibilities, and whether or not any fights broke out or something like that, right? There's this obsession with like, was it quote unquote peaceful? But what they don't realize is that when you read someone like Dr. King, he talked about how the goal of their action was to create a crisis. whenever they went into a city, to create a crisis that stops business as usual and forces the powers that be to the table to negotiate, right? That's what they were doing. And that conception of nonviolence seems to be unknown to most people. So I've spent a lot of years trying to popularize that in whatever way that I can, because I believe that it's the only way that we're actually going to be able to move the needle.
It's every time I hear, oh, you're not doing the cause any good by disrupting traffic or by doing this. It's like, have you studied how any change has come about?
Right.
It's so frustrating, but it's intentional because the way that we're taught about movements is that in hindsight, everybody agreed on it. And then you read from Birmingham jail and you realize, like, I think a lot about the white moderate that talked about. And it's the white moderates like think that they are on the good side. And they're like, hey, please don't be disruptive. Change will come, but like don't be a pain in my ass, essentially.
Yeah. So absolutely.
We learn about movements though, primarily in the way that like, oh yeah, in hindsight, like everybody agreed on this. We're good. Nobody complained that they weren't able to get to work on time because of Montgomery bus boycott or whatever. Like, you don't talk about that side of things. And so you have all of these sort of in the white moderate category today who just genuinely don't understand that change has to be disruptive. It's the only way.
Yeah, you have to make it more difficult, make it expensive for oppressors to keep on oppressing. You have to stop business as usual. That's how it's done. Most people, when they're talking about nonviolence, are not talking about stopping business as usual. And if you're not talking about stopping business as usual, you're not really talking about anything. I wrote about this when October 7th happened, because you had all of these people clutching their pearls. Even people who usually talk about decolonization and resistance and all this kind of stuff were clutching their pearls at what happened on October 7th. And even though I am not a proponent of armed struggle, I'm like, you can't talk about nonviolence in a way that ultimately leaves no options for the oppressed to confront the boot on their neck.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I try to tell people nonviolence is actually a method of combat. And if you're not talking about nonviolence as a method of combat, you're talking about abstract ideals that are not useful to people, you know? So if people are trained to do nonviolence, then it's an option, and they should use it, if it seems like it'll be useful to them. But where people are not trained for nonviolence and they don't have the strategies to do it, you can't demand that they just let people punch them in the face and keep turning the other cheek, And so I think that that's a huge hurdle to get over, is when you and also people who are not proponents of nonviolence also think that's what you're talking about when you say nonviolence. So like, then you get this big pushback from other people going, oh, you're appealing to liberal ideals and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, was Dr. King a liberal? I don't know. Like I don't tend to judge people like that, but Dr. King was a militant revolutionary who just didn't believe in that it was not only did he believe in the moral superiority of nonviolence, he also believed that it was a practical solution for people who were outgunned by the US military and also a minority in the country. But I find that most people that I talk to or that are talking about nonviolence are not talking about power. They're not talking about how to disrupt oppressive power. And that is how you disrupt oppression, right? But on the other side of that too, and I know that I'm assuming that you see this because I know that you also follow some of the same people that I do, and I've learned from some of the same people that I do. There's also this conflation of nonviolent struggle with protests. that is also not very helpful, because people, we have such a limited education on how to do collective action through nonviolent struggle, is that we kind of have a very limited set of tactics that we default to, you know, marches, rallies, protests, and then whatever we saw in the last movement. So if the last movement did encampments, we're going to do encampments, you know. And that's also a huge limiting factor for the power of our movements, that, you know, when we talk about hope, that one of my frustrations when I watch is like, I want for us to learn from movements that have gone before us and movements around the world that are innovating, and to learn how the principles of nonviolent confrontation work. So that we can continue building on our knowledge and perfect our skills. And this also ties into your question about why is it important? It's important because the powers that be, the oppressive powers that be, they are learning. They are increasing in knowledge and strategies to dismantle all kinds of resistance, not just nonviolent resistance. But since we're talking about nonviolent resistance, they are getting better at repressing nonviolent resistance all over the world. And it's because they watch what we do and they strategize. We don't even watch what we do. So you have this graph of like, we have more people mobilized than ever around the world at any time in history. The mobilizations are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But the victories that we're winning through nonviolent struggle are decreasing, you know? You know. And I actually talked to Erica Chenoweth about this. And she mentioned that the reason why we're seeing less victories through nonviolent struggle is not because nonviolent struggle is getting weaker. It's because we are not engaging in the more powerful, more disruptive types of tactics of nonviolent struggle, you know? And I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that we don't learn from other movements, you know, and we don't learn about the skill of doing nonviolent struggle well. One of the things that I mentioned was my experience in 2020. Like, I thought that people would be more open to doing that, you know, and I found that ordinary people are, you know, I found that like ordinary people love learning. Like, they love learning about other movements. Like, why did what Gandhi did work? Why did what Dr. King did work? You know, and the movements that they were part of. And just while I'm saying it, I don't believe that Gandhi or King single-handedly did these things. It's just shorthand for talking about this stuff. But they love learning that. But there are people who have probably been involved like more, a bit more long term, that can be very resistant to learning about strategy when it comes to nonviolent struggle that I'm learning. That is what I'm learning, which is heartbreaking to learn, but also I think is a part of why we find that we are able to mobilize so many people, but unable to escalate very far, you know, nonviolent tactics. So it's like we get a bunch of people mobilized. The energy is great at first. We get an up curve as far as victory, and then we don't know where to go from there. And then because we have this limited vocabulary, you have people come saying, "Well, the only thing we can do now is start setting things on fire."
How do we get? I think about that 3.5% rule. I don't know, it's 3.5% rule. And I've been thinking a lot. I'm like, I don't even think, I think in some movements, it's about recruiting. We got to get enough people. We got to, we got to be attractive. We got to be cool. We got to be whatever. I'm like, I think we have enough people. So how do we, what's the next step? Do we need a revolution school to equip and empower the 3.5%? What do we?
Yeah, I think that what people are missing about the 3.5% rule, oh my gosh. You know how you know, like you have like a good piece of information or a good term or something like that, and then once it gets into the zeitgeist, it becomes a completely different thing.
Yes.
And it's like, wait a minute, like that's not what deconstruction is, or that's not what intersectionality is, or what like how did it become that? I'm seeing there years ago, I was the only person I knew that was online trying to get people to know about the 3.5% rule. You know, now I know I'm not the only person that was, but just my circle was small enough that like I didn't know many other people that do. Now I see the 3.5% rule circulating Instagram, and I saw someone say, okay, for instance, the current encampment movement now that is happening, someone said the reason why these encampments are springing up so fast is because of the 3.5% rule. And I'm like, that makes no sense.
What?
The 3.5% rule is not about how quickly a tactic spreads around the world.
Funny.
You know,
Interesting.
like that is not what that is. And then I see other people who are like, if we just get 3.5% of the population to protest, things will change. And I'm like, that is also not what that means. You know, like the 3.5% rule has some other key words in there that people are skipping over.
Yeah.
Because it's about active, sustained, strategic, nonviolent action. Also adding into that research that tactical innovation is so important, right? And so it's like now I see people aiming to get 3.5% of the population on the streets to protest. And I'm like, well, the 3.5%, even Erica Chenoweth, like in her next book, Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, like has a whole section on 3.5% rule because people started being a bit too formulaic, right?
Yep.
And saying like, well, if we just get this number, this percentage, then things will change.
Yeah.
No, not necessarily. The 3.5% rule is an observation about a certain data set, right? That showed that no regime was able to withstand the sustained nonviolent resistance of 3.5% of the population, which is grounds for hope and gives us an idea that like it doesn't take the majority of the people. But even Chenoweth acknowledges that if you have 3.5% in active, that are actively in sustained nonviolent resistance, then that implies that you probably have a majority that are passive supporters, right? You know, that's number one. Now let me return to the other things while I'm on my soapbox. Is the part of like the sustained strategic engagement is what we need, right? Like for instance, what's happening right now is we have an encampment at UCLA, right? The encampment endures an attack from police and protesters. Those in the encampment say we need more support. So more from the community comes to support, like parents and friends and faculty and all that kind of stuff. That is on like that is consistent with the data of what we see about social movements, right? Like people get drawn into social movements because they have loved ones in them, right? And so now the encampment gets bigger and it's so inspiring because the community comes to support them. However, at a certain point, that encampment is going to get as big as it can. And the community support for it is going to reach a peak and then it's going to decline, right? And I'm saying all of this to say that like you can have 3.5% of LA at this encampment, right? But if there's not enough like mutual aid to sustain that encampment for a longer time, you know, that encampment is going to fail. You need not fail, it's going to fold, not fail. It's going to end, right? And that's the part that people are missing when they talk about the 3.5% rule is like participation is a huge key factor in movement success. However,
it's not the only factor.
It's not the only factor. Exactly. It's not the only factor. You need more than participation. You need tactical diversity. You need to understand how the system works, right?
Yep.
Like where are the sources of where are the political resources that this system is pulling from to use, and you need to cut them off, right? So like to your point is like earlier you mentioned people blocking a highway, right?
Mhm.
I don't have a problem with people blocking a highway. But sometimes I do want to ask why this highway? Like
Mhm.
because who is your target? You know? Who is the target of this action? And how does this action put pressure on them? You know? And sometimes it does, right?
Yep.
But other times people are just blocking a highway because they saw other people block a highway one time, you
Mhm.
know? So anyway, to your point about what do we need, this is the question I was asking at a recent conference with like leading activists from all over the world. I'm going, this room is awesome. Like the people who had like the things that y'all have done, your reputations precede you, you know, they're not all, I mean, most of them are not famous because people who do this kind of work don't get famous, right? But if you're but if you're reading and studying about social movements, there are people in the room that you're like, that action that you did is like in a textbook somewhere, right? And I'm in this room asking like, well, how do we get more people to know this? Because like you said, I don't know what you do. Like if you set up like an activist school or whatever, and there are educational platforms for activists. But one idea that I have had is wherever you have movements, is that people invest in training activists. You know, I think that the job of a community organizer, of which I am no longer, thank God, um, is to empower other people, right, and to build their capacity.
Yeah.
So one thing I suggested recently, you know, in the current moment, and whenever we're listening to this, I think the principle is what we should grab, right? Not just like, yeah, grab the principle here. Is that if you have an encampment and you all are gathered there and you've been there, you're going to be there for a few weeks, you hope, or whatever. Use that time to build capacity, right? Like
Mhm.
we don't just need teach-ins about the history of the problem, although we do need that.
Mhm.
But use that time to skill up, help people understand how nonviolent struggle works. You know, use that time to take stock of your resources, your strengths, your weaknesses, the strengths and weaknesses of the system that you're opposing, and
Mhm.
make a plan. You know, because you're all there, right? Like you've
Yeah.
seized this space,
Mhm.
so use it strategically. But regardless of how it happens, we need to invest in training. And we see that like the civil rights movement trained people, the
Yep.
Serbian nonviolent revolution trained people, you know. But I think there are some blockages to doing that kind of work, you know, in the mass protest era.
Why do you think there's blockages?
I think people are afraid of how power, I think people are afraid of power.
Mhm.
And so when you say training, who is going to do the training?
Mhm.
Are they leaders? Because leaders have power and we don't want power. Like, I think people are afraid of power.
Yep.
And my particular perspective is that I don't think power is avoidable, you know? And I think that feminist work has been helpful for us to think about the difference between power over, power with, you
Mhm.
know, and I can't remember the other one. But I think that we run the risk of power blindness when we
Yeah.
when we try to say that like our group needs to be absolutely horizontal, you know. I think that that sets us up to do the same thing that people do when they say I don't see color, you
Mhm.
know. Is that no, like, I mean, you see color because if I got abducted one day and they said, well, can you describe Andre, you're not going to say, well, he's a floating pair of glasses. Like you know,
Yeah.
you're gonna say, well, he's black, he's light skinned or something, right?
Mhm.
I think that we do the same thing. I think that sometimes horizontalism is getting in our way because we're so afraid of power that we don't want to do anything that has any semblance of power. And there's a book called Twitter and Tear Gas that I read years ago that talks about this, how we end up at a tactical freeze where the only thing that we know we can do is the thing that we did initially.
Mhm.
Because there was no hierarchy in us deciding to make this encampment, right? No one was the leader telling us what to do.
Yep.
And the other essay that comes to mind is the tyranny of structurelessness, right? Is that when you have these groups of people and there are no clearly defined roles and responsibilities, that the best that you end up being able to do is do consciousness raising work.
Mhm.
But then when you want to take action, like if you want to, I don't know, yeah, if you want to do more actions, people have to have roles and responsibilities to do that. And I think that that is one huge obstacle to training, is because I think that a lot of times there is this inherent power dynamic in
Yeah.
training, you know, that people want to avoid. The other thing that I don't necessarily understand, and maybe you have an answer or insight on this, is that I have found that like a lot of people are anti-strategy.
I have found that too, and I don't really understand why.
I heard someone once refer to strategy as the master's tools.
Oh no.
Oh no, don't do that.
Oh,
And I was like, okay, we need to read like the armed struggle revolutions, because so that people can understand that. And the reason what I just did subconsciously, and I think I need to name it out loud, is I think that people think that it's more revolutionary to be more impulsive, reactive, destructive, right?
mhm.
So I don't think that they realize how strategic even armed struggle is against oppressive power. And so like they don't realize like the Haitian Revolution. I tell people like these people think the Haitian Revolution was won on vibes, like but like no, like they strategize. These were ex-military, you know, that organize their people for conventional warfare or armed warfare or guerrilla warfare. I don't really know what category you want to put that in.
Mm.
And they don't realize that like planning, strategizing, those are revolutionary prerogatives,
Yeah.
you know?
I wonder sometimes if like people are just so against the system, and
Mm,
strategy involves observing and sitting with the system and really
yeah.
seeing how it works and really
Mhm.
understanding these pillars of power. And it
Yeah.
requires that we're looking at something that is very ugly for a decent
Yeah.
amount of time. And I
Yeah.
think that might be one of the reasons that there's this sort of like distaste.
Yeah. That that could be, it could be triggering, right? Like
Yeah.
that, I never considered that. The other thing I think is that we feel like the stakes are too urgent and pressing.
Mm,
Like strategizing is sometimes a slower process, you know, because it does take some time to analyze the situation. So I think that sometimes people feel like we need to act right now, you
yeah.
know, and they
Mhm.
don't feel like they have time. Like, so I do think that some of the social media discourse around social justice gets in the way, because it's like I think that people feel like strategy is a luxury and a privilege, you
Mm.
know, rather than I used to try to explain it to the groups that I founded. It's like, think of yourself as like a little island, you know, that's being dominated by a much larger and powerful nation, right?
Mhm.
Like you have to be more strategic, actually, because you don't have as much to use to accomplish your goals. It never worked, but I still used to use that example.
It's the like resources versus numbers thing. We don't have resources, we have numbers. And when you have numbers, you have to be aware of how you're using it, careful of how you're using it. And I do think numbers win out if done strategically. But yeah, it's tricky. So if I'm like, okay, if I'm a new activist and I want to go on a journey of really looking at movements and reading maybe some incredible thinkers and authors, where's a good place for me to start?
Yeah, I think that the book that I recommend to people, because I feel like it's, as far as like the concepts of nonviolent struggle, a bit of history, and paying attention to who the author names, right? Like that is how I study, right? It's like when I'm going through a book, like if they mention another book or another thinker or whatever, I'm like, okay, well, I need to look into that next. Is Blueprint for Revolution, for sure. You know, Serge Popovich's book, Blueprint for Revolution, is such a good and readable primer on nonviolent struggle that introduces the concepts in a really accessible way. I feel like it's pretty thorough. And if you paid attention to the other people that he mentions, you know, and go look up Gene Sharp, go look up Erica Chenoweth, go look up those folks, then you will have a good, you'll have some good theory around nonviolent struggle that's based on actual experience and actual history that you can apply. The one limitation that I would say for Blueprint for Revolution is that I think that most of the people they reference are white, aside from Gandhi and King, but also take note of those too. Like, yeah, you should read some of Gandhi. I wouldn't recommend his autobiography, but you should read some of Gandhi. He has a book on nonviolent resistance that I would recommend. So maybe a companion to Blueprint would be, something from Dr. King. Like there's the Radical King that Cornel West put together, which is his speeches, but there is like his essay on his journey to nonviolence in there that will give you some concepts. But King also wrote 2 books about the campaigns that he was a part of. There's Stride Toward Freedom about the Montgomery bus boycott, and there's Why We Can't Wait about the Birmingham campaign. Of the 2, I would recommend Why We Can't Wait, because you see he does a good job of giving the context of Birmingham, why they chose it, how Project C, the campaign to desegregate Birmingham, came about. That's a good one. I would also add 2 more. I would add This Is an Uprising by Mark and Paul Engler, that give a good idea of like the different schools of nonviolent uprising, and they give good examples too of different movements. And Beautiful Trouble, because Beautiful Trouble is just like, it's tactics, it's good. It's got a lot of creative tactics and principles and stuff like that. Any one of those books is a good place to start, but if someone put like together a list and was like, I'm going to learn about nonviolent struggle, and you took 3 to 5 of those together, I think that would be a really good base.
That's a great list. I'm going to add to my reading list. I think when you start to learn about these tactics, there's just something that happens in your mind where something unlocks, and then you're able to see things differently. So even if it doesn't have the whole, like, obviously, Blueprint's a few years old, Dr. book is older, but like it's not about duplicating the same stuff. It's saying, they were able to see that this was the tools that this oppressive force was using. And here are the counter tools that we were able to use. And so then you start to see things in the way that's like, you're seeing these forces, you're seeing where the strongholds are, where the pressure points are. And so once you start looking at it that way, I feel like, so some of my background is digital marketing, and I feel like Serge Popovich is like a digital marketer.
Oh, for
Like
sure.
and so then I was
Yeah.
like, oh, I can bring this background into my activism. And I want
Absolutely.
everybody to bring their stuff in here. Like, I don't want the only thing that people to be doing to be some, cookie cutter, one size fits all type of activism. No, bring your
Yeah.
shit. Let's do this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like any skill, you know,
Mhm.
any skill has a set of principles that you learn, whether by doing it and studying it or whatever. But there are principles that you learn acquiring any skill. And when you learn about those principles, you can then apply them in a bunch of different ways. Like for me as a musician, like I do understand music theory,
Mhm.
right? And so because I understand music theory, I know how to write songs. I know how to put melodies together. I know, like I can play my scales on the piano. A scale is not a song,
Mhm.
you know, but I know what's happening in the music when I listen to it because I understand the theory.
Yeah.
And when you're reading about nonviolent struggle, I think especially starting with a book like Blueprint, because he does illustrate concepts, right? And so what I found myself doing is, was it by the time, I can't remember if this was before I got to Blueprint or after, because I started with Thoreau. I started reading Civil Disobedience by Thoreau,
Okay.
and then Tolstoy, and then Gandhi, and then King. Like I went through like a genealogy of these things. But once I like got a hold of like language like pillars of power or whatever, I found myself as I read just writing that in the margins of whatever book I was reading when I came across it. And you start seeing like, wow, like this principle is popping up everywhere, right? Like the principle of consent, with power. It's like reading all these books, and every time I see, oh, there's an example of like just like the power of consent, I'm writing that in the margins or pillars of power or whatever. And just like you said, like you start seeing things differently. You start seeing all these conflicts differently, your own situation differently, you know.
This is my last question. So what is
Okay.
one thing that you really would love for people who are engaged to keep in mind as we move forward in this?
I think the thing that is at the forefront of my mind is that this is still a marathon.
Mm,
We can't tell right now how far we are away from a free Palestine. We won't be able to know that until it's in hindsight, especially because the conflict situation does not stay static, right?
mhm,
The powers that be fight back, right? And once they react to what we do, the conflict situation changes,
mhm,
you know. And I think what I have seen in my observations of, social movements throughout history and my experience in social movements is that oftentimes we underestimate how long it's going to take for us to reach whatever our vision of tomorrow is. You know,
yeah.
I saw this happen with Black Lives Matter in 2020. We had an influx of people, more people than we'd ever seen on the streets for Black Lives Matter.
Mm,
And by October, by November, people were worn out, disappointed, exhausted, demoralized, all that. From here, from where we are right now, I'm I am excited or I'm inspired by the students all over the world who have been building encampments at their universities. And I recently wrote an article saying, I think that basically people who are in encampments now should consider that like there's a countdown that started as soon as the encampment went up to the day when the encampment is going to come down.
mhm.
whether it's because the semester ends, graduation comes, people get tired, they go home, the police break it down, whatever it is, the weather gets too intense, whatever it is, that countdown has begun and you don't know when it will reach zero. So while you're encamped, build your capacity for the next thing. And people got, not people, most people responded positively, but I did get a few, you know, of the typical like, oh, this is liberal ideology. Oh, this is armchair, whatever, whatever. Have you been to one of the encampments? By the way, the answer is yes, I have. All of that. But I think that part of that reaction is linked to the idea that some people think that Palestine will be free this summer. And I hope those people are right.
Yeah.
You know, don't get me wrong. However, social movements are always a long struggle. Like where we got today, where millions of people all over the world are saying free Palestine, is the result of decades of activism, decades of organizing that got us here. Where we got in 2020, with the whole world rising up after the killing of George Floyd, that was decades, generations. Generations of resistance to anti-Black violence to get us there. And I say this to say that in each of these examples, and I'm going to throw Occupy in there as well, because even Micah White, who first tweeted Occupy Wall Street, who strategized about putting that message out there, wrote a book called The End of Protest. And one of the things that he wrote in his, which read it carefully, anyone listening, if you're going to get that book, read it carefully, because there's so much in there that I think you need to think critically about.
Okay.
But one of those things he wrote about was the 8 principles of revolution that he felt like he gleaned from Occupy. And one of them was the 28-day rule, where he felt like people can only endure 1 or 2 attacks from the police. You know, tactics that go on for more than 28 days. Like the longer that it goes on, the weaker it becomes. The point is not for me to talk about the encampments. It's just the juxtaposition between the generations and the decades and the years that it takes to move the needle and our capacity to struggle, right? So that we don't underestimate how long this could take, so that you can use your resources wisely, you can struggle wisely. The Montgomery bus boycott took 13 months. It took 15 years for the Indian revolution or the Indian nonviolent movement that Gandhi was part of to finally oust the British. You know, it took 10 years for Otpor to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic. You know, and that is partly because it's not just our movements that do this, but there are larger, longer political factors at play as well. Not even just political factors. Like when you look at the end of slavery, you have to look at the collapse of the cotton market. You have to look at the contribution of the boll weevil. You have to look at, you know, all of these things come into play. And so I say all of that to say that if we understand that we have a long struggle ahead of us, you know, or think of it as a protracted struggle, then I think that that demands that we struggle wisely. That we don't just think about like, what can I do over the next few weeks? You know, what if, God forbid, like that these institutions do what they usually do, and that is give a semblance of justice. I'm borrowing language from Brian Martin, who wrote a book called The Backfire Model, which is such a good book because it talks about the 5 tactics that the powers that be use to manage our outrage. And one of the things that he mentions is that Yeah, they use established channels to give a semblance of justice.
Ooh.
So what if the universities say, we're going to set up a committee about divestment, or we're going to take a vote on full divestment, or we
Mm.
promise that divestment will happen over the next 3 to 7 years, you
Mhm.
know? What are you going to do to keep the pressure on these institutions,
Yep.
you know? And it's not just about the divestment, but in every way that we're looking at Palestine and saying we want to free Palestine, you know, how are we going to keep the pressure on those leaders and weaknesses of the system so that it has to grant us the demand, you know? Not to mention the fact that like you mentioned, Palestine is connected to so many other not just struggles, but it's a part of a larger system. That's
Yeah.
what I want to say. It's a part of a much larger system. So I think that's the thing, is that this is a long struggle. This is a marathon. I don't think that that just calls for self-care and centering your well-being, although it counts for that too. But it also counts for the way that you struggle.
Mm.
Because when this movement declines, when the mobilizations decline, and they will decline, they always do, we still need people pushing for this. And if you don't want to see it decline, then that also has to be, I think it's possible, you know, theoretically,
Mhm.
for there not to be a decline and that we keep on pushing, keep on pushing, keep on moving. But that takes strategy as well to think about. Now, I'm a musician, so I know like you drop a single and then you watch the streams and then like there's gonna be a spike on like release day and there's gonna be a tapering off as the days goes on. So what do I have to do? I gotta drop another single.
Mm.
If I want to see those streams, that line of streams keep going up or stay at a pace going up, I got to keep dropping singles. And the movement has to think like that. You know,
Yep.
no matter what the struggle is, like what are you going to do to keep struggling? The last thing I want to say is use an example from James Lawson, who was so essential as a nonviolent strategist during the civil rights movement that his name is involved in just about all of the major campaigns of the civil rights movement. James Lawson is still alive today. He's in his 90s. He lives in Los Angeles, and he holds a monthly training on nonviolent struggle.
Mm.
I went a couple of times, and I went one time and I asked him, no, I went in 2017, I think it was 2018 maybe, and someone asked him about the Women's March because I think the Women's March LA had just happened. And he said something that showed just how different the folks who came before us think about nonviolent struggle. He said, because the Women's March had tons of people, it had tons of attendance. I think we had 750,000 people come out in LA.
Wow.
He said the Women's March should be targeting the banks. And they should be doing something every single week to disrupt the banks. I just want to like highlight that like he said weekly. That's how different they think about struggle, you know. And I think that's how you have to think about it, is you have to assume that you're going to be fighting this battle, or this battle is going to need to be fought for a long time.
Yep.
So how do you keep showing up?
Mm-hmm. How do we make it sustainable? How do we keep
Mhm.
ourselves engaged? How do we keep other people engaged? How do we make sure we're all taken care of?
Yeah.
It's vital.
And how do you build the strongest resistance possible?
Yeah.
That is always my question, is how do you build the strongest resistance possible? And we need creativity
Mm.
to do that. We need wisdom to do that, but we also need humility
Yeah.
to say like, I didn't realize how rare it was for someone to say, I'm going to study everything I can about nonviolent struggle. I didn't know how rare that was. I'm just learning how rare that was, you know, because it just seemed obvious. I didn't know. So I had to pursue the question. And I think that we have to keep that sense of humility that yields curiosity, that helps us to keep on searching for how do we make it stronger? How do we make it stronger?
That's good. It's a good challenge for me as well. Thank you so much, Andre. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That was cool. There was definitely a lot that was relevant in that interview. It was relevant last year. It's still relevant this year. There was bits that I was going to take out because I was afraid that they would feel like they made the interview too dated, like the part about the encampments and stuff. But I thought that the wisdom he shared in that was too good to exclude. So I'm curious, Dima, what do you think about the interview? What were some of your key takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of takeaways. I actually think that I'm glad you didn't cut too much out because so much of it is actually very relevant to what we're seeing right now, with the suppression of our First Amendment rights and what's happening now on campuses again. So it brought up a lot of thoughts of sort of like very related to what's happening today. There were two sort of things that came up in the conversation though that kind of rose to the top for me because there's so many things we could talk about. Are kind of in relation to movements. And one of them was, I think it was toward the end of your interview, talking about abusive behavior that you see in movements. And that being somewhat destructive, not only in the movement, but then later, if you do achieve your goals, what do you do about the fact that there was sort of an abusive, there was some abusive behavior within the people who were trying to get to this goal. And I think you said something like toppling, or maybe Andre said toppling a regime to become another repressive regime. That was really striking to me. It reminded me of, and I don't know if this part of, I read The Foundation a long, long time ago. This is a sci-fi book. I don't know if this is part of the book because I couldn't actually easily find it by looking through the book, or just part of the TV series. But in that book, there is this idea of the second foundation. So the foundation comes to sort of topple imperialist regime. But then there's this knowledge in advance of that there will be repressiveness and there will be violence in that very act, that you will need a sort of second foundation to come in and make sure that that is not the cornerstone of the new civilization, that it isn't grounded in violence and repressive behavior. I find that very interesting, and I think it's why we need so many different kinds of people in the movement. People are impacted by it, and we need people to be calling out the repressive parts within the regimes or within the movements to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I don't think people often are thinking about that. It's like, just, of course you want to get to the goal, but what do you do about the things that essentially will cause oppression later on?
Yep. That ends justify the means mentality can sort of inject imperialism and oppression back into the movement. And this is something I think we have to be so aware of. And it's easy for me when I want change to happen to say like, okay, we just need to push, we need to get this done, you know, and not necessarily being abusive in a movement, but saying like, okay, what do we got to do to push this forward? But understanding that how we act now is laying the foundation, or is creating the future that we want to see. And so if we're pulling in tools that we don't agree with to try to get to an end, you know, I think that can be really dangerous. And it's people being abusive in movements is a problem. It's been a problem. It's still a problem today. And it's a manifestation of maybe not understanding the ways that this can affect a movement, but also it's maybe a lack of support for leaders as well, and the giving the emotional tools and the trauma-informed frameworks to approach movements in a way that's healthy. So
Well, and I think it's also the urgency. I think in a lot of these movements, there's urgency. And so to do self-reflection is very difficult. It's like you're constantly being hit with something that you have to react to. And so you don't really have time for that self-reflection. And another thing that came up in the interview that I thought was actually quite interesting when we talk about this was this idea that people within movements are afraid of power. They're suspicious of like hierarchy or people making decisions where maybe they haven't been able to get everybody's thoughts on it and get like full agreement, which is sometimes impossible. There's going to be people who have different opinions. And I thought that was also really interesting because it's like, how do you strike the balance? Because yes, if you create movements where there's sort of an authoritarian or there is this hierarchy, that can feel very much like what you're trying to not have. But if you have none of that, and you do, I think in the interview, you called it horizontal work in the sort of like world of like tech where I kind of had most of my career, we called it like flat orgs. And it basically means like there's no leader. And what I saw in like winter of 2023, when a lot of organizations and groups wanted to do something, wanted to help, and they were forming, they were thinking about this. They were saying, we don't want to have power structure. We want to make sure we don't have that in our movement. But they did it to such an extreme, in my opinion, having kind of observed it. You know, I was kind of joining lots of different groups that were wanting to do things to help people in Gaza. And they were doing it to such an extreme that they couldn't really get anything done. It was just a lot of like, okay, everybody's opinions, everybody's thoughts, nobody's taking a lead, nobody's a leader. And it was so much the point that nobody wanted to step in because it felt like, well, then you're being a powerful person within this, and we're trying to be not powerful, not have power. And so that is where, like, where do you balance that? Where do you bring in some of these ideas of power, but in not a way that it hurts people? It allows you to be effective, but not hurt the movement and not hurt people individually within the movement and the movement collectively too.
Yep. That's a great kind of thought to ponder and a great question. And the difference of sort of somebody who's bossing you around and a real leader, because with leadership comes a responsibility to support and stay engaged and even take care of yourself so that you can show up for the people that you're leading. I've seen this too. In my own self, I tend to want that sort of horizontal work. And then it was interesting for me, and I helped host a retreat in the beginning of last year, and I was like, I don't want anybody to feel like they have to lead, or follow. And then, but I was hosting an event for people who'd been in activism for a long time, and almost everybody was like, no, Hannah, we take the leadership role. Like, you should lead this. We are okay with leadership as long as the leadership is good leadership. And we need that because we need people to make some decisions, to push some things forward. Trying to have consensus on everything, like you said, will really bog down the movement. And so it's creating the imagination in our minds, and even like pushing some of our own relationships with authority, or healing some of our relationships with authority, probably healing some of that so that we can come to what can leadership look like in a transformative movement that's healthy, that's not authoritarian, that's not bossy, that really is for the health of everybody involved. And it's built on mutual respect. It's not built on like power over. Yeah, I think it would be cool to have somebody on, and maybe we bring Andre back on to really have that be a topic of an episode, because I think it's a conversation that would be great to have.
Yep, I 100% agree. I think it is about about having more leaders. I think what you said about this group of people telling you they would like you to do the leadership role because they trusted that you would do it in a way where they would feel part of something important, but not being sort of told what to do, but guided And I have had the same thing happen. People have said, please actually do help lead this. And I think what we're landing on is we need to grow and teach new leaders how to lead in a way that allows them to take this role that not everybody wants, but does it in a way where everybody can feel good and get behind it.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. That's a good takeaway. Those are two great takeaways. If you are listening and you have some takeaways that you would love to share with us, we would love to hear them. So feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information and some other info is in the show notes, and you can also always DM us on Instagram. We check those regularly. So thank you so much for listening. Anything else to add, Dima?
Nothing to add. Thank you, Andre, for coming onto the show with Hannah. It was a really great interview, and I hope everyone enjoys it and learns something from it.